you generally speaking can achieve a lot better results if you don't really care who gets the credit and your focus is on winning. And I think that's totally true in business environment as well, where people have a tendency to compete and everybody wants to say, hey, it was me that did that.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Courageous Choice. I'm really excited today to welcome my friend, a mentor, and someone I've respected throughout my career, Ian Ziskin. Thank you so much for being here with us, Ian.
Great to be with you, Jamie. Thanks for the invitation.
So we've known each other for a while, but I'm really grateful that actually just a few weeks ago I had the chance to spend more time in person than I think we may have ever. And for those who are listening who don't know Ian, I just want to share a little bit about his background. So Ian is the president of the Exec Excel group. He is a coach. He's a board member. He's a former CHRO of large global organizations. He has continued to innovate and contribute to the HR profession. He's written or co-edited 4+ books. He's really a thought leader in this space, and he's just a fun person to work with because I feel like you always make me think and stretch my thinking, which I always really appreciate, Ian.
Thanks for the kind words, Jamie. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It's really, it struck me the opportunity of just that group of people that you surround yourself with that showed up for you and were part of your retirement celebration and really just a tribute to you and your family and what you've created in your career.
Thanks. It was very humbling, but also, maybe a good reminder that each of us can have some kind of small influence on people around us, even sometimes without even realizing that we are in that moment. So it was very enjoyable to be around all those folks who showed up a couple of weeks ago to celebrate with me.
It really is true. And when I was thinking about this podcast, you were truthfully one of the first people I thought of. And then I started thinking of examples of courage, right? I mean, this is talking about courage. And I was like, gosh, Ian and I could talk about, personal courage. We could talk about courage as you were coaching people to leaders to make significant choices. We could talk about when you're wearing the CHRO hat and teams you've been on that had courage to make dramatic change or transformation within organizations. So maybe I'll just ask, through when you think about courage through your experience, what comes up for you?
Yeah, maybe a couple of different angles on it. The first one is pretty universal in all those different kinds of engagements, with people that you were just mentioning. I find that human beings have this almost limitless capacity to deny, deflect, or dismiss facts or data that do not reinforce their preferred view of the internal or external environment. And as a result, because we're human, we tend to avoid things that we don't like or don't want to deal with or don't believe. And that usually gets us in trouble, right? So some of the most courageous things that I've seen leaders or people even in non-leadership roles do is allow reality and truth to filter in so that you end up making better, more informed decisions based on what's actually going on versus what you would like to be going on, because those two things are typically quite different. So that usually requires people facing into something personally or professionally that isn't always great news, but must in fact be dealt with. I think the corollary to that I've seen over and over again in working with leaders as a coach or in my CHRO days as well is the fact that most people in their jobs need to make a decision, kind of a fork in the road between, do you want to do your job or keep your job? And I find a lot of people are, making decisions based on, what can I do or say that minimizes the risk of me getting in trouble, with my boss or somebody else, or reduces the controversial nature of whatever it is I'm about to say or do. And, yes, there's obviously great value in being politically savvy enough to make sure that you remain in the job that you're in order to continue to contribute and have an influence. But I think if that's your number one criteria for success, you're generally speaking not really going to do your job. And quite often, most of us find ourselves in situations where doing the job means, we have to tell somebody something they don't want to hear. We have to take some type of action that might be unpopular, but absolutely necessary for the business or the environment that we find ourselves in. And so, I prefer to be around people who are more focused on doing the job, including the difficult parts of the job. That takes courage. Than to be around people whose main motivation in life is how do I stay under the radar and keep my job, but therefore not do the hard things that need to be done. Those are a couple of angles, I think, on courage as I've seen it.
Yeah, really striking because it is that tension around being able to self-preserve or provide for your family, but then are you like not even doing the job, right? And the other thing I've seen is I was thinking about as you were talking is some of these cultures that, really support that status quo. And so it can be even more courageous, quite frankly, to be the disruptor or the one to stand up and have that difficult conversation, yet necessary. So when you think about that first example that you shared and leaders who are kind of willing to face what's real, even if it's not what they want it to be, what have you noticed that they do to either gain that perspective or even open the door to be willing to like know that those two things might be different?
Yeah, I think they actually do some things. So whether it's intentionally or just naturally, I think they still have a lot in common. A couple of the things that I see regularly is these kinds of folks are not only willing but really wanting to surround themselves with people who are better at them, better than them at certain things, but also have very divergent, diverse, different points of view about a lot of things. That tends to improve the chances of getting good advice and counsel and feedback about what needs to be addressed, and minimizes the risk of having everybody around you just telling you how smart you are and how much they agree with your perspective, as the leader. So yeah, it's nice to have people on the same page, but it also can be deadly from an organizational point of view if everybody's basically just saying, believing the same thing over and over consistently. So I think that's a big differentiator that I see quite commonly. The other one is that most of these people who deal with reality better than others have a tendency to focus a lot on bringing the outside in and external perspective. So they pay attention to what's happening, broadly speaking, in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, in terms of trends in the workforce and the workplace and the world of work. They pay attention to what competitors are doing. They listen to what customers are saying, as well as investors. I mean, these are all perspectives that in some way have to be brought in from outside of your organization, because if you don't do it somewhat proactively, it's really pretty easy to lock yourself behind closed doors and delude yourself into believing that you're great, either as a leader or as an organization. So I would say that's another thing that some of these more courageous leaders that you were asking about do quite consistently.
When you think about your own career, and we talk about this, is there a story or a point in your career that you think of specifically where you felt like there was a decision point, right? You were going to you knew you needed to do something. It wasn't super comfortable. And can you share it with us?
Yeah, there are many. One that comes immediately to mind, I think really hits on the point you were just asking about. In my first chief HR officer job, so I'm going back now quite a ways, about 20 years ago, I had been in the job literally about 2 weeks. And the entire time that I was there, in those first 2 weeks, I heard about almost exclusively one issue that people kept bringing up to me, no matter where I went and who I talked to. And basically, the issue was that prior to my arrival, about 6 months prior, two people had been promoted to president level roles. The theory being that they were going to be in a horse race to compete for the CEO job as part of the succession plan. And of course, I was working for the current CEO at the time. Literally 2 weeks into the job, my first CHRO job ever in my career, had dinner with my boss, and he checked in and said, "Hey, you've been here for 2 weeks. What are you hearing, from people?" So of course, my knees were knocking under the table, thinking, "Can I share this feedback that I was getting?" I knew I should share it, of course, but doesn't mean that sometimes you're not afraid and nervous to do so, right? So I took advantage of the opportunity and his invitation to share with him what I was hearing. Basically, let him know that one of the people who had been promoted to a president level role, who happened to be focusing on sales and marketing. Everybody said, if this person gets promoted to CEO, I'm quitting. I'll never stay with this company. This person's a terrible leader. Now, it turns out that one complication here is that same person had been mentored by the CEO for about 20 years. So the CEO obviously had a lot of personal commitment invested in this guy, versus the other person who was, highly capable, well respected, but didn't have as long a relationship with the CEO. So I shared this all with the CEO. He kind of looks at me across the dinner table and he says, "Yeah, that's very interesting. I need to think about that." And then literally waited 3 months for him to come back to me till one day he came into my office and said, "Remember that conversation we had at dinner 3 months ago?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, you're right. Now we have to decide what we're going to do about it." And it was very clear to me, not in the moment, but later, that he'd spent a fair amount of time doing his own research, talking to other people as a result of me sharing this uncomfortable information with him. And, moral of the story basically was, do your job or keep your job. I was thinking to myself, I could be fired in the first 2 weeks if he doesn't want to really hear what I have to say, but it is my job to share with him what I did. And organization became much better off as a result. And he, as the CEO, actually benefited greatly by it as well, because his credibility was really being undermined by this choice that he had made. So that was a pretty important inflection point in my career in terms of underscoring the importance of truth and reality and bringing it to other people who might not see it the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I can feel it in the pit of my stomach, actually, what that would have been like sitting at that dinner table. And then it also, good for him to have the courage to see reality, to your point, with someone that he had invested a lot of time in and probably had some blind spots around their behavior or whatever was causing people to say those things.
Yes, yes. It's funny too, because I learned another really valuable lesson more as it relates to coaching and advising, because, a lot of people I've shared that story with over the years, one of their first reactions was, well, why and how did you wait 3 months, to hear back from him? And of course, I think now in retrospect, I probably would not have waited quite as long. But I do realize this was a very emotional, but also business important decision that he was about to make, because of his longstanding relationship with this person. And it was probably the first very vivid example of what I now call my number one coaching rule, which is that the truth has a time and a place. In other words, you need to tell people what they need to hear, right? But you have to do it in a way that is going to cause the person you're delivering the news to absorb it, think about it, take it on board, all with the objective of having them do something about it ultimately, rather than just getting it off your chest so that, you can sleep better at night that you did, right? So in his case, he needed some processing time. This was a big deal for him and a big decision. And even though he was a very decisive person, generally speaking, I know he struggled a lot with coming to the conclusion that he did, but we ended up, I think, with the right decision and actions that came after. And so it was more important to me that he acted in a way where he owned the decision rather than that I, pestered him quicker to get him to make a decision that he quite clearly was not totally comfortable with.
Yeah, and if he'd been I'm sure if, like, he was being forced to make that decision faster or you knew there was a timing issue, then that would have affected how you responded, but
The way I felt at the time. I mean, I look back now, of course, it's 20 years later. You have a lot more clarity, I suppose, than you do in the moment. But what I was thinking at that time was, I need to give him some time and space. I didn't necessarily know it would be 3 months of time and space, but that's what it turned out to be.
it's an interesting thing because, like, courage doesn't have to be it, the how, and actually getting your point across, like to your point, and someone's readiness to hear it and be able to process it i- i- is different than like brash. I need to be right. I need to be the one to tell you this big news, or I need to, right. It's not ego. It can show up in really small ways too. And I think about that, your point around how you say it and what you say. I don't know. When you think about like maybe an upcoming leader and how they might demonstrate courage or internally feel courageous, is there something in there that you think about?
Well, of course, for people who are more up and coming leaders, quite often they're learning and doing things for the very first time, especially these types of, stressful, uncomfortable circumstances, right? So a lot of it is about, I'll say practice makes perfect, to overuse that phrase, of getting what I like to think of as leadership muscle memory, where you practice over and over again. You're being in these kinds of circumstances, thinking through in advance, what kind of questions am I going to ask in order to provide good advice to somebody or to make a good decision myself as a leader? But also, what are the other contextual circumstances, that I find myself in, right? Because I think a lot of leaders feel like, I'm going to show everybody how tough I am. I'm going to give people feedback. I'm going to hold them accountable. Accountability and feedback are essential to being a really good leader, but you also have to understand what are the circumstances that the other person is dealing with, and how likely are they going to receive in a constructive way what you're telling them, with the objective, of course, being not just tell them, but what are you going to change about their behavior or about their results due to the fact that you're telling them something and giving them tough advice. Because guess what? Whether you're an up and coming leader or a highly experienced CEO, it's been my experience over and over again that people basically do not like confrontation. They do not like delivering bad news. They oftentimes do not like receiving bad news either. So people have a tendency to avoid these types of interactions, when in fact, everyone would benefit greatly by the learning and by better decision making that comes from confronting things in a constructive way. But not often do people feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah. You were talking about earlier, like that some of the leaders that are good at this, they kind of create an environment where they normalize the, you play the devil's advocate, or who's going to be like, intentionally having people who are going to bring those different perspectives. And I think that's regardless of kind of any level team, really creating that space for constructive disagreement or debate or different perspectives. Like not only do you get to better decisions, but by normalizing that, it helps overcome that discomfort that pretty much everybody has with, giving bad news or being, it makes it more normal. And like you said, it's that practice of getting comfortable with something that most of us are some level uncomfortable with.
Yeah, that practice is what, in part, I think in large part, tends to normalize things. But it also is very true that if you've the type of leader who never asks people for feedback, how are things going? What's getting in your way? What's working really well for you? What can I be doing differently or better as the leader to enable you to do your job as effectively as possible? If you don't ask those kinds of questions on a fairly regular basis, you have almost a 0% chance of people actually telling you what's going on, versus if you do ask on a regular basis and then actually act like you're appreciative of the feedback and perhaps even do something about it, you might have a 51% chance of people being comfortable enough to tell you what you need to hear. So I think a universal truth for every leader I've dealt with over, 43 years of my career, be they senior or be they more junior and up and coming, is that if you are good at creating an environment where you ask people for feedback and advice and counsel, and then don't beat them up, when they tell you something that you wouldn't necessarily have preferred to hear, you'll find over time people will become increasingly comfortable with and better at providing you that feedback. And if you don't ask for it and then you get it eventually and you do beat people up, not surprisingly, people are not going to be very uh, aggressive about sharing with you things that they think is bad news because they don't want to have to deal with the consequences. Again, human beings being who and what they are.
Yeah. There's a lot of levels in the lessons I think that you're sharing that probably we started before we started recording talking a little bit about basketball and my lack of following college ball, but I do actually love I played for a long time. But when you think about, I think about team sports, you think about coaching, clear analogies here in the workforce as well. And you've already shared some, but are there any additional kind of lessons from sport that you think about are important as in business today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I grew up playing a lot of basketball. Now, other than the fact that I, couldn't really run, jump, or shoot, I felt like I had a great career ahead of me. So it's probably why I ended up in business, but not in basketball. However, I learned a ton, from playing a lot of years and being around a lot of basketball players who, in many cases, were a lot more talented than me, which is the following. One, the best teams not only have highly talented people, but more importantly, they have people who understand their role and contribution. Not every team has somebody who's going to be a 30-point scorer. But if you happen to be on a team where you have somebody who's a 30-point a game scorer, you have to understand, how else can I contribute? Am I going to rebound? Am I going to pass? Am I going to play defense? Am I going to, set screens for other people on the team? What's my way of personally contributing that lifts the entire team? The other thing I've seen over and over again, in sports, including basketball as I played it, is you generally speaking can achieve a lot better results if you don't really care who gets the credit and your focus is on winning. And I think that's totally true in business environment as well, where people have a tendency to compete and everybody wants to say, hey, it was me that did that. When am I going to get the credit? Credit's appropriate, of course, when somebody makes a contribution and you should want to recognize them. But more importantly, I think the credit comes from we achieved something great collectively as an organization. I contributed in my way. Other people contributed in their way. And we raised the bar for everyone. And that's how we won. To me, that's much more rewarding than, somebody pointing to me and saying, hey, Ian, you did something specific that was great. It's nice when you get that recognition, but not nearly as energizing as being on a winning team. That's my takeaway from, many years of playing basketball, albeit not as well as lots of other people I was playing with.
No, I love that, right? Whoever scored the winning points, like that's not the game. I mean, that's exciting, but it's not the whole game. And it's definitely the whole team that gets you to that point. And even those on the bench, quite frankly, the energy of the supporters and the rest of the glue within an organization are often just as important.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference to know that people you're surrounded by who you care about and think highly of are rooting for you. I mean, that is tremendously energizing and builds confidence, which I actually think is probably an underutilized, under talked about capability of the most courageous leaders is, as I said earlier, surround yourself with people who are better than you at certain things. But I also think you have to have the comfort level of, maybe I want to be successful as the leader of the team. But in order to do that, I have to build a level of confidence among everybody else who's around me that they can contribute well. And if they make a mistake, we're going to learn from the mistake, but we're not going to spend all of our energy trying to blame people or figure out who did what wrong, because that's pretty de-energizing, for most people. So I think those are also some capabilities that really great leaders that I've been around tend to display more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah. And even back to your example with your first CHRO role with your CEO, by him not previously having not, or maybe being viewed as defending or protecting someone whose behavior wasn't values aligned or contributing to the desired outcomes, that was affecting his effectiveness as a leader, right? So being able to remove a player or for the greater good or whatever. Um, so we talked a few weeks ago about how now we're learning that midlife with us all living longer is like 45 to 75, and so you're entering a different phase, but I know you still contribute to not only leaders and business, and you're a professor and you're continue writing. I know you're still contributing in lots of ways. But as you look backwards, since we just have a moment to reflect, what are some things you're most proud of from your career and your life?
Great question. It's always hard to answer when you're talking about yourself. But I think if I'm really honest, most of the pride comes from the relationships that I've been fortunate enough to build with other people, and seeing those relationships turn into success for those other people. So somehow or another, I stumbled into the HR profession, obviously early in life, and even a lot of the coaching I do now. And it's always come back to me in many ways, repeatedly, how much pleasure I get from seeing other people fulfill their potential and somehow satisfy their own dreams, life and career dreams, and the confidence and joy, that comes from that. So that's probably what I'm most proud of. I think that's on a professional level. On a personal level, all of those things that I managed to do professionally enabled me to do something really important to me for my family, particularly my kids, which is I've always believed really strongly in the value of flexibility and freedom of choice. So getting my family to a place where, we had enough flexibility and freedom, partly because of financial resources and partly because of the kind of human beings we are, where we experiment and learn and try different things. Getting my kids comfortable with the idea that they would have choices in life to pursue their passions, because there are so many people in the world who do not. They end up being born in a place, surrounded by people in a place where they really don't have a lot of flexibility and freedom to achieve their dreams. And so I've always valued that extremely highly, particularly for my kids.
Well, both your sons, or all of your sons, you could just see the pride, and your wife, she's incredible of the family that you've built, and that was really wonderful to see.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, yeah. So the you talked a little bit about HR and kind of falling into that profession, and you've seen it change a lot over the time that you've been involved, even as you supported it in different ways. When you think about where it's going, we talked about some really intriguing things a couple weeks ago. What's on your mind if you were just sharing some thoughts around kind of the future of HR?
Well, I think the things that are probably on my mind the most now are there because they're sufficiently different, from how I grew up in the profession. And I'll mention a few of them. Certainly, everybody's talking about artificial intelligence and the potential implications of that. And, we all talk about it so much, which basically probably means nobody really knows what we're talking about, or nor what's going to happen, other than big change. But, what will be positive about it, what will be negative or concerning about it, still isn't completely clear to me. But that has huge implications for the role that HR people play in the world. Related to that, but different, is all of the expectations now around flexibility to work from where you choose, in a manner in which you choose, based on a schedule that you choose. And, there's always been this drive more toward flexibility at work, but obviously COVID really accelerated that over the course of a few years. And now everybody's dealing with, remote, hybrid, get back to the office, et cetera. And that's going to take years, I think, really to fully shake out. That also has big implications for HR people. But probably the even bigger one than I haven't mentioned yet is this idea that, as an HR professional, most of our development and focus over the years has been on the quote unquote employee. I'm going to find you. I'm going to hire you. I'm going to try to hang on to you for as long as I possibly can and develop you and keep you, motivated and engaged. I don't think that's going out of style anytime soon, but it's not going to be 100% of the way that work gets delivered. As you well know from your day job, there's an increasing number of people who are wanting to be doing gigs and freelance work. There's also a tremendous number of people who want to work from anywhere. And increasingly now, because of artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning and the like, the work is not necessarily even going to be done by human beings. So the biggest change in the profession, as I see it, is what I like to describe as HR as orchestra conductor. Where you're basically saying an orchestra conductor is not an expert on playing the flute, the violin, the timpani, and all the other instruments in the orchestra. Their job is to go find the most talented people in the world and incorporate it together and make beautiful music. And I think HR people are being asked to do that in solving these large, complex, cross-functional, multidisciplinary, big, hairy kind of problems. They have to be able to bring people together from different walks of life with different skill sets that go well beyond the boundaries of HR to solve these problems. And now have to go a step even further, because a lot of the solutions are not even going to be delivered by people. They're going to be delivered by robots and other kinds of machines and artificial intelligence. And being conversant in all that stuff is non-trivial, and it's a lot different than what most HR people were asked to do, certainly 43 years ago when I started in the profession, but even as recently as the last 10 years.
So true. It's like new instruments have been invented, and so we have to shift how we make the music, I guess. As we kind of bring this to a close, I guess I want to ask, what words of advice do you have for leaders who want to make a difference?
Probably the best advice I ever got was from a former boss and mentor of mine that's really served me well over the years. It's very simple, which is find a void and fill it. Every organization has problems and issues, has resource challenges, has people who say, it's not my job, therefore I'm not going to focus on fixing it, whatever it is. But those things have a tendency to get in the way, diminish the effectiveness of the organization, frustrate people because they can't get their arms around it to solve it. And I just love being around people who see problems and then take some kind of initiative to see if they can help resolve it. And over and over and over again, over the course of my career, I've been around people who are really great at that. And every time they distinguish themselves from everybody else who says it's not my job, or I'm too busy, or I don't care. And it's also served me personally, frankly, quite well, because it's enabled me to get involved in stuff and interact with people who might have been outside of the norm of who I would typically be interacting with on a regular basis, which helped me, build relationships and establish credibility. And eventually people started to see me as, hey, this guy's actually going to help us solve some problems here. And then if you get that kind of reputation, it's kind of gold, because there are so few people who are seen that way on a consistent basis. So find a void and fill it. That's the single most important thing that I would advise.
I love that advice. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And extreme gratitude for you taking time to share all your wisdom with us today. I'm grateful to know you personally, excited to see what's next for you personally, professionally, and otherwise. And thanks to the audience for joining us on today's episode. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to The Courageous Choice. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review to help get the word out about the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future conversations. If you'd like to know more about gig talent, please visit gigtalentagency.com or email us at podcast@gigtalentagency.com. See you in the next episode.